Disgust practically radiated from her as she pinched her nose against the fumes of burning diesel and flicked a crisp $100 bill at his grease-stained boots. "Buy a muffler for that piece of junk," she snapped. He made no move to collect the money, opting instead to stare her down in absolute silence. It hadn't dawned on her yet that she was trespassing on his driveway. The dust in the valley didn't settle. It just hung in the air, a fine, gritty mist that coated the back of Chloe's throat. She sat inside the climate-controlled cabin of her matte black G-Wagon, watching a smear of brown earth streak across her windshield. 48 hours ago, she had been in a glass boardroom in Manhattan, dissecting a hostile takeover that netted her firm $80 million. Now, she was in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, staring at a rusted metal gate that looked like it would fall off its hinges if the wind blew too hard. Chloe pressed the heel of her hand against her temple. A dull, pulsing ache had taken root there 3 days ago. Her therapist called it severe executive burnout. Her board of directors called it an extended sabbatical. She had bought 50 acres of premium, untouched valley land sight unseen, desperate for the one thing her wealth hadn't been able to buy her in the city: absolute, uninterrupted silence. She rolled down the window to punch the keypad for her newly installed security gate. Then, the noise hit her. It started as a low, mechanical cough, followed by a violent, sputtering roar. The smell invaded her car next, a thick, choking stench of unburnt diesel and hot oil. Chloe gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. Creeping down the gravel road that ran parallel to her pristine, newly paved driveway was a tractor. It was a decrepit John Deere, the original green paint long surrendered to rust, sun bleach, and mud. Black smoke belched from a bent exhaust pipe. Driving it was a man who looked exactly like the machine he operated. Faded denim, a flannel shirt ripped at the elbow, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Sitting between his knees was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, wearing bright pink noise-cancelling earmuffs. Chloe laid on her horn, a long, sharp European blast that sliced through the heavy morning air. The man didn't flinch. He slowly pulled a lever, the gears grinding with a sound like tearing metal, and brought the smoking beast to a halt right at the edge of the property line, partially blocking the turning radius of Chloe's gate. Chloe killed the engine of her SUV. She shoved the heavy door open, her designer loafers crunching onto the loose gravel. The heat outside was immediate and oppressive, smelling heavily of dry sage and cow manure. "Excuse me," she yelled over the idle of the tractor engine. The man reached down and turned a rusted key. The engine shuddered, choked, and finally died, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. He looked down at her. His face was deeply lined around the eyes, skin baked a dark leather brown by the sun. His hands, gripping the cracked steering wheel, were thick with calluses and streaked with black grease. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was flat, gravelly, betraying absolutely no emotion. "You're blocking my gate," Chloe said, crossing her arms. She stared at the rusted metal of the tractor, deliberately curling her lip. "And polluting my air. I bought this property for peace and quiet, not to inhale whatever toxic sludge that thing is burning." The man blinked slowly. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a rag, and wiped a smear of oil from his thumb. "This is a county easement," he said, nodding to the dirt path he was on. "I'm checking my fence line." "Your fence line," Chloe repeated, looking past him to a miserable stretch of barbed wire that separated her immaculate landscaped entryway from a field of overgrown, yellowing grass. "Right, listen." She reached into her leather handbag, pulling out a slim silver money clip. She peeled off 2 crisp $100 bills. She walked over and held them out. The little girl in the pink earmuffs stared at her with wide blue eyes. "Take this," Chloe said, her tone shifting to the clipped, authoritative cadence she used with her junior analysts. "Get that piece of junk towed. Buy a muffler. Or better yet, buy a new carburetor. Just keep it away from my property line. I have a retreat to finish building, and I can't have my contractors dealing with this noise." The man looked at the money in her hand. He didn't move to take it. He looked back up at her, his eyes scanning her spotless white blouse, her manicured nails, the tense, rigid line of her shoulders. "Keep your money, lady," he said quietly. "Tractor works fine." "It's an eyesore," she snapped, stepping closer, frustrated by his lack of deference. People usually scrambled when she offered cash. "And it smells. I don't want to see it." "Then don't look at it," he replied. He turned the key. The engine roared to life, violently spitting a cloud of black smoke that washed right over Chloe. She coughed, stumbling backward, waving her hands frantically in front of her face as the grit stung her eyes. By the time she caught her breath, coughing into her sleeve, the tractor was already 30 yards down the dirt path, lumbering away at a torturous 5 miles an hour. Chloe stood in the dust, her chest heaving. She looked at the $200 bills crumpled in her fist. She shoved them back into her bag, a hot, prickly anger spreading across her chest. "Fine," she thought, wiping a fleck of soot from her cheek. "I'll just buy his miserable little strip of dirt and evict him." A week later, the silence Chloe had paid $15 million for was broken by the sound of rushing water. She woke up at 5 a.m., the cold mountain air leaking through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her master bedroom. The smart home system was flashing a red error code on the wall panel. She threw off her silk sheets, her bare feet hitting the heated concrete floors, and walked to the window. Outside, the newly installed state-of-the-art subterranean irrigation system had suffered a catastrophic failure. A geyser of muddy brown water was shooting 10 feet into the air, flooding the front acreage and washing away $1,000 worth of imported Japanese maple saplings she had demanded be planted near the gate. "Damn it," she hissed, grabbing her phone. She dialed her lead contractor in Denver. It went straight to voicemail. She dialed the local plumber the contractor had subcontracted. Voicemail. By 6:30 a.m., the geyser had turned her front yard into a swamp. The water was creeping toward the foundation of the driveway. Chloe was standing on the front porch in her cashmere robe and rain boots, frantically tapping her phone screen, shivering in the biting morning wind. The smell of wet, raw earth and crushed roots was overwhelming. Down the road, headlights cut through the early morning fog. An old, beat-up Ford pickup truck came rattling down the county easement. It slowed as it approached her property line, the tires crunching heavily on the gravel. The truck stopped. The driver's side door groaned open, and the man from the tractor stepped out. He was wearing the same faded jeans, a heavy canvas jacket zipped up to his chin. He stood by the fence, watching the water erupt from the ground, his face impassive. Chloe felt a flush of humiliation. The last thing she wanted was this local yokel watching her multi-million-dollar estate wash away into the mud. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" she yelled over the rushing water, her voice shrill with stress. He didn't answer. He walked to the bed of his truck, rummaged around for a few seconds, and pulled out a massive, rusted pipe wrench. Without asking for permission, he ducked under the wooden rail of her front fence, his boots sinking 2 inches into the thick, red mud. "Hey, what are you doing?" Chloe shouted, stepping off the porch. The mud immediately sucked at her rain boots, nearly pitching her forward. The man ignored her. He waded directly into the center of the flood, right where the water was shooting upward. He didn't flinch as the freezing water soaked his jeans and jacket. He dropped to his knees in the muck, his hands feeling around blindly beneath the churning surface of the water. Chloe stopped a few feet away, wrapping her arms around herself. She watched, shivering, as his thick fingers found whatever they were looking for under the mud. He locked the heavy wrench onto a submerged valve. The tendons in his forearms stood out like steel cables as he gritted his teeth, throwing his entire body weight against the wrench. There was a harsh metallic groan. The geyser sputtered, dropping from 10 feet to 5 feet to a bubbling puddle. Then it stopped completely. The silence rushed back into the valley, broken only by the sound of water draining away into the saturated earth. The man stood up. He was coated in freezing mud from his chest down. Water dripped from the brim of his baseball cap. He wiped his hands on his ruined jacket, picking up his wrench. Chloe stood there, her mouth slightly open. The panic in her chest had subsided, replaced by a strange, uncomfortable tightness. She wasn't used to people fixing her problems without sending an invoice first. "Main pressure valve blew," he said, his voice completely level, as if he hadn't just taken an ice bath in a mud pit. "Your city contractors probably didn't regulate the PSI for the altitude drop from the reservoir. You need a pressure reducer." He walked past her, heading back toward the fence. "Wait," Chloe blurted out. He stopped, not turning around. Chloe swallowed hard. She hated feeling indebted. It felt like a loss of control. She reached into her robe pocket. She always kept emergency cash. She pulled out $500 bills. "Here, for your time. And the dry cleaning." The man turned his head slightly. He looked at the money in her hand, then up to her face. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, striking against the dirt and grease on his face. "Don't need your money," he said. "Don't be ridiculous," she insisted, her tone hardening to cover her embarrassment. "You just saved me thousands in foundation damage. Take it, I insist." He walked over to where her G-Wagon was parked in the driveway. He didn't take the money. Instead, he pulled a small, smooth riverstone from his pocket, something a kid might pick up on a walk, and set it gently on the hood of her SUV. He pointed at her hand. "Wind's picking up," he said quietly. "Better put a rock on that cash, or it'll blow away." He turned and walked back to his truck. He climbed in, the springs groaning under his weight, and put it in gear. As he drove away, Chloe saw the little girl sitting in the passenger seat, peering out the window. She waved a small, mitten-clad hand at Chloe. Chloe didn't wave back. She stood in the freezing mud, clutching $500 in a white-knuckled fist, glaring at the taillights of the rusted Ford until they disappeared into the fog. She felt small. She hated feeling small. "I'm buying his land," she whispered to the empty, muddy yard. "Whatever it takes." A month passed. The mud dried. The contractors fixed the plumbing, regulated the PSI, and finally completed the main house. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Massive panes of imported German glass, reclaimed wood, and dark steel, sitting like a jagged crown jewel in the middle of the rugged valley. Chloe was hosting her first dinner party. It wasn't for friends. She didn't really have those anymore. It was for her board members and 3 private equity investors. She was pitching them on turning her adjacent acreage into a high-end, exclusive eco-retreat for burned-out executives. The dining room smelled of seared Wagyu beef and truffle oil, courtesy of a private chef she had flown in from Jackson Hole. Soft jazz played from invisible speakers embedded in the ceiling. "It's breathtaking, Chloe," said Richard, a silver-haired investor holding a glass of Pinot Noir as he looked out the massive window at the sunset. The sky was burning in shades of violent orange and bruised purple. Absolute isolation. The market for this kind of untethered luxury is exploding. "Exactly," Chloe said, swirling her wine. She wore a sleek, backless black dress that felt like armor. "We control the environment. We offer them the illusion of the wild without the inconvenience of it." "What about that?" Richard pointed a manicured finger toward the window. Chloe's jaw tightened. About a half-mile away, visible just over the crest of a low hill, was a cluster of buildings. A weathered barn with a sagging roof, a cluster of rusted grain silos, and the faint, blinking yellow light of a tractor slowly making its way across a dusty field. Even from here, with the heavy glass blocking the sound, Chloe swore she could smell the diesel. "That," Chloe said smoothly, keeping her voice light, "is a temporary eyesore. The local who owns that scrap of dirt is a stubborn holdout. But everyone has a price. I've already contacted a surveyor to map the exact property lines and pull the county records. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse, bulldoze that barn, and plant a grove of aspens to screen the view." Richard chuckled. Spoken like a true shark. The next morning, the house was quiet. The smell of stale wine and cold steak lingered in the air. Chloe sat at her massive quartzite kitchen island, a cup of black espresso warming her hands. The doorbell chimed. It was the surveyor she had hired, a nervous-looking man in a high-vis vest carrying a thick cardboard tube. "Ms. Harrington," he said, stepping into the foyer and wiping his boots meticulously on the mat. "I pulled the topographical maps, the county tax records, and the satellite overlays." "Good," Chloe said briskly, leading him to the kitchen island. "Show me the boundaries. I want to know exactly how much of a buffer I need to buy from the neighbor." The surveyor unrolled a large, glossy map across the stone counter. He placed a heavy brass compass on one corner to keep it flat. The map was covered in topographical lines and colored zones. "Okay," the surveyor said, tracing a finger over a small pink square in the center of the map. "This is your parcel. 50 acres. Extends from the county road to the creek." Chloe nodded. "And the junkyard next door?" The surveyor paused. He looked up at her, adjusting his glasses. "The what, Mom?" "The neighbor. The guy with the rusted tractor and the collapsing barn. Where are his property lines?" The surveyor coughed awkwardly. He pointed his pen at a thick, dark green line that bordered her pink square. "Well, ma'am, that's the boundary." He dragged the pen along the green line. It went past her property. It went past the creek. It kept going. Chloe frowned, leaning closer. "What is all this green?" "That's the neighboring property," the surveyor said. Chloe stared at the map. The pink square, her $15 million estate, was a tiny postage stamp. The green area surrounded it entirely on 3 sides. It swallowed the valley. It crawled up the mountains. It spanned across the river. It was massive. "How big is this?" Chloe asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. The espresso in her stomach suddenly felt highly acidic. 10,400 acres, the surveyor said quietly. Chloe's eyes traced the map. The scale was dizzying. "Who owns this? Some corporate conglomerate? A logging company?" "No, ma'am." The surveyor pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and smoothed it out. It was a county tax record. "It's a private family trust, the Beckett Ranch. It's been in the same family since 1890. The water rights alone make it one of the most valuable private holdings in the state." Chloe felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. "How valuable?" The surveyor swallowed. "It was appraised last year for tax purposes, ma'am. $120 million. Chloe stared blankly at the paper. "But the man next door, he drives a rusted tractor. His barn is falling down." "Oh, that?" The surveyor pointed to the tiny cluster of buildings a half-mile from her house. "That's not the main house. That's just the old equipment shed by the county easement. Mr. Beckett leases that front acre to the county for grazing overflow so he doesn't have to keep his loud machinery near his actual house." The surveyor tapped a spot on the map about 5 miles deep into the green zone, tucked against a pristine, private alpine lake. "The main lodge is back here. 10,000 square feet. Private airstrip. He lives a pretty quiet life, mostly." Chloe couldn't breathe. The air in the massive, modern kitchen felt thin. She had thrown a $100 bill at his boots. She had offered him $500 for a ruined jacket. She had told him to buy a muffler for his piece of junk. Sam Beckett didn't own a scrap of dirt. He owned the entire valley. She wasn't the queen of the mountain. She was just a guest in his front yard. She slowly sat down on a velvet bar stool, the cold stone of the counter pressing into her forearms. The silence of her house suddenly felt less like a luxury and more like a tomb. The air conditioning hummed, a sterile white noise that suddenly felt suffocating. Chloe sat at the quartzite island for an hour after the surveyor left, watching the digital clock on the smart oven flip from 9 to 10 a.m. The silence of the house pressed against her eardrums. She looked out the massive German glass windows. The weathered barn and the rusted silos in the distance didn't look like a junkyard anymore. They looked like a trap she had walked right into. $120 million. She had thrown crumpled cash at his boots. She had told a man who owned the entire mountain range to buy a muffler, a tight, hot band of humiliation wrapped around her chest. In the corporate world, when you miscalculated this badly, you called a meeting. You controlled the narrative. You offered a concession to save face. Sitting here, hiding behind her imported glass, felt like a concession of defeat. Chloe stood up. She marched into her bedroom, stripped off her silk loungewear, and pulled on a pair of raw denim jeans and a heavy wool sweater. She jammed her feet into a pair of leather riding boots, pristine, unworn, bought specifically for the aesthetic of her mountain retreat. She grabbed her keys and walked out to the G-Wagon. She was going to drive to the main house. She was going to look Sam Beckett in the eye, offer a strictly professional apology for the misunderstanding, and secure a legally binding agreement that his farm equipment would not operate within a half-mile of her property line during her investors' visits. She would treat it like a merger, cold, rational, transactional. She pulled out of her gates and turned right, driving past the county easement, following the GPS coordinates the surveyor had left behind. 5 miles down the highway, she reached the real entrance to the Beckett Ranch. There was no rusted gate here. It was a massive archway of raw, thick timber and river stone. A discreet bronze plaque set into the rock simply read, Beckett Trust, Estidos, 1890. The gate itself was heavy wrought iron, currently standing wide open. Chloe drove through. The pavement immediately gave way to a crushed limestone road that kicked up a plume of white dust behind her SUV. The drive took 20 minutes. The scale of the property was deeply unsettling. She passed rolling valleys of thick green alfalfa, miles of tightly strung, perfectly maintained fencing, and a herd of black Angus cattle so large it looked like a dark stain spreading across the distant hillside. The air pressure began to drop. The sky above the mountains, a brilliant, piercing blue just an hour ago, was curdling into an ugly, bruised purple. The wind picked up, buffeting the heavy SUV, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. Dry lightning was rolling in. She crested a hill and finally saw the main compound. It wasn't a house. It was a small village. There were massive, gleaming steel equipment sheds, a row of immaculate white barns, a helicopter pad, and tucked against the edge of a deep blue alpine lake, a sprawling lodge built of massive, interlocking logs and dark glass. Chloe slowed the car, her heart thumping, a heavy, irregular rhythm against her ribs. She parked near the closest barn. The wind was howling now, tearing dead leaves from the cottonwood trees and throwing them violently against her windshield. She stepped out of the car. The temperature had plummeted 10 degrees. The air felt heavy, charged with static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "Can I help you?" Chloe jumped, spinning around. Sam Beckett was walking out of the cavernous doorway of the steel equipment shed. He wasn't wearing the ruined canvas jacket today. He wore a heavy Carhartt vest over a grey Henley, leather work gloves tucked into his back pocket. He didn't look surprised to see her. He just looked impatient. "Mr. Beckett," Chloe said. Her voice caught in the wind. She cleared her throat, forcing her shoulders back. We need to talk." Sam stopped 10 feet away. He looked at her pristine leather boots, then up to her face. A sharp, jagged fork of lightning struck the ridge a few miles behind her, followed seconds later by a low, bone-rattling boom of thunder. "Bad time," Sam said, his voice easily cutting through the wind. "Front's moving in fast. No rain in it, just electricity and wind. We're on fire watch." "This will only take 5 minutes," Chloe insisted, stepping closer, desperately trying to project authority. "I saw the county records. I realize now that you own the surrounding acreage. I came to formally apologize for my previous assumptions. However, I am developing a high-yield executive retreat on my 50 acres. and I need to discuss a zoning agreement regarding your machinery near my property line." Sam stared at her. He reached up, pulling his baseball cap down tighter against the wind. "You drove up here, right before a dry storm, to talk about zoning." "I prefer to handle business immediately," Chloe said, her chin lifting. Another crack of lightning split the sky, much closer this time. The thunder cracked like a rifle shot. A radio clipped to Sam's belt suddenly hissed, bursting with static. A frantic voice crackled through the speaker. "Boss, we got a strike. South Ridge. Wind's catching it. It's moving fast." Sam unclipped the radio. "Location? Right behind the old county easement shed, heading straight for the valley floor." Chloe's stomach turned to ice. The old county easement shed. That was 50 yards from her property line. 50 yards from her $15 million, highly flammable timber and glass house. Sam clipped the radio back to his belt. He didn't look at her. He broke into a dead sprint toward a massive lifted F350 parked near the barn. "Wait," Chloe yelled, running after him, her smooth leather boots slipping on the limestone gravel. "My house is right there. My house is downwind." Sam threw open the door of the truck. "I know where your house is," he grunted, swinging up into the cab. He fired the engine. It roared with a deep, deafening horsepower. "What do I do?" Chloe shouted over the engine, panic finally cracking her perfectly composed facade. "Get in your car," Sam yelled back, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "Drive back. If the fire crosses the creek bed before we get a line cut, you evacuate. You take the highway west. Do not pack your bags. Just drive." He slammed the door, threw the truck into gear, and tore off down the dirt road, leaving Chloe choking in a cloud of white dust. She stood frozen for 3 seconds. The smell of distant smoke suddenly hit the back of her throat, sharp, acrid, and terrifying. She scrambled into the G-Wagon, her hands shaking so violently. She dropped her keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. She slammed her foot on the gas. By the time she reached her property, the sky was black. The wind was a physical force, screaming through the valley, bending her newly planted, expensive saplings parallel to the ground. She hit the brakes at the top of her driveway. A wall of thick, yellow-gray smoke was rolling over the hill behind Sam's old rusted shed. Beneath the smoke, she could see the angry, vivid orange glow of flames chewing through the dry, dead grass. It was moving with terrifying speed, pushed by the gale-force winds directly toward her immaculate black steel fence. In the middle of the field, between the fire and her property, was Sam. He wasn't in the massive, modern truck. He was sitting on the rusted, green John Deere tractor, the piece of junk she had told him to buy a muffler for. Hitched to the back of the tractor was a massive, heavy, iron disc plow. Black diesel smoke belched from the exhaust pipe as the tractor screamed, pushing the engine to its absolute limit. Sam was slamming the steering wheel back and forth, driving parallel to the flames. The heavy iron discs bit deep into the dry earth, churning up raw brown dirt, burying the fuel and creating a 10-foot-wide fire break of bare soil. The heat radiating from the field was intense, even from inside Chloe's car. She could see the flames licking at the tires of the old tractor. She threw the car into park and stumbled out. The roar of the fire sounded like a freight train. The air was thick with flying ash that immediately coated her lips and stung her eyes. "You're going to burn," she screamed, though there was no way he could hear her. Sam didn't stop. The tractor lunged forward, hitting a hidden rock, nearly bucking him off the cracked leather seat, but he kept his foot buried on the throttle. He was 100 yards from her fence line. 50 yards. 30 yards. The fire surged, a massive gust of wind blowing a sheet of flame directly over the tractor. Chloe screamed, clapping her hands over her mouth. The tractor emerged from the flames. The paint on the hood blistered and smoking, but the engine kept roaring. Sam wrenched the wheel hard, cutting the final stretch of earth right up to the edge of the creek bed, connecting the dirt barrier to the water. He slammed the brakes, killing the engine, and threw himself off the side of the machine before it had even fully stopped. He ran toward the creek, dropping to his knees, and plunged his face and hands into the muddy water. The fire hit the churned-up dirt of the fire break. It flared angrily, spitting embers into the air, starved of fuel. It crawled along the edge of the raw earth, searching for grass, but found nothing. Slowly, violently, the flames began to lay down. Chloe stood by her G-Wagon, her chest heaving, her throat burning with smoke. Her knees gave out. She sank down right into the gravel of her driveway, resting her forehead against the cool metal of her front tire. She didn't cry. She just gasped for air, the smell of burning sage and diesel exhaust filling her lungs. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely, utterly powerless. The first drop of rain hit the hood of the G-Wagon with a fat, heavy smack. Then another. Then a dozen. Within seconds, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a deluge. The freezing water slammed into the earth, instantly drowning the remaining embers of the fire. The smell of the air changed abruptly, from choking ash to the deep, intoxicating scent of wet dust and bruised sagebrush. Chloe didn't move. She sat in the gravel, letting the freezing rain soak through her heavy wool sweater, plastering her hair to her cheeks. She was shivering, but she didn't care. A heavy pair of boots crunched on the gravel. She looked up. Sam was standing over her. He was soaked to the bone. The left sleeve of his Henley was singed brown, and his face was smeared with black soot and mud. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath the wet fabric. He didn't offer his hand. He just looked down at her, his pale eyes unreadable. "Fire's out," he said, his voice gravelly, barely audible over the drumming rain. Chloe stared at him. She looked past him to the smouldering black scar on the earth that stopped exactly 12 feet from her property line. She looked at the smoking, blistered John Deere tractor sitting sideways in the mud. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw. She swallowed hard, tasting ash. "You," she started, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to stand up. Her legs were shaky. She wiped the wet hair out of her eyes, smearing soot across her forehead. "You saved my house." "I saved my pasture," Sam corrected quietly. "Your house just happened to be in the way." It wasn't said with malice. It was just a statement of fact. But it stung, piercing right through the remnants of her corporate pride. "I don't understand," Chloe said, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, shivering violently. "You own $120 million worth of land. You have helicopters. You have a fleet of trucks. Why were you fighting a fire on a rusted piece of junk?" Sam wiped a stream of muddy water from his chin. He looked back at the old green tractor, Because a diesel engine without a computer chip doesn't shut down when the heat sensors get tripped by a grass fire, he said. Because heavy iron discs cut dirt faster than a rubber tire. Because sometimes the old, ugly thing is the only thing that works when the pressure is on. He looked back at her. And because my grandfather bought that tractor in 1978, and it's never failed me once. Chloe felt a hot flush of shame burn under her skin, entirely separate from the cold rain. She looked down at her ruined, muddy leather boots. I was horrible to you, she whispered. The wind howled around them, but the words felt deafening. I threw money at you. I treated you like I was in your way, Sam finished for her. Chloe looked up. Yes, Sam didn't smile, but the hard lines around his eyes softened just a fraction. Miss Harrington, people who buy 50 acres of isolation usually aren't looking for peace. They're usually running from something they don't want to look at anymore. I figured you just needed a minute to realize the scenery wasn't the problem. Chloe opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The absolute clinical accuracy of his words left her totally stripped. She wasn't a billionaire CEO here. She wasn't a visionary. She was just a tired, burned-out woman, standing in the mud. I'm sorry, she said. It was the first time she had said those words without a strategic agenda in over a decade. It felt clumsy, raw. I am so deeply sorry. Sam held her gaze for a long moment. Then he slowly nodded. Rain's getting heavier, he said, turning back toward his truck, which was parked up on the county road. You should get inside. Your foundation's gonna take a beating with all this runoff. Wait, Chloe said, taking a step forward. Your tractor. It's stuck in the mud. How are you going to get it back? Sam stopped. He glanced over his shoulder. I'll bring the heavy wrecker down tomorrow when the mud dries. Let it sit for tonight. He paused, looking at the pristine black gates of her driveway. Unless it's too much of an eyesore for your investors. Chloe flinched. She looked at the burned, blistered, heroic piece of machinery sitting in the rain. It's fine, Chloe said softly. Leave it as long as you need. Sam touched the brim of his wet hat. Have a good night, Miss Harrington. It's Chloe, she said. Sam turned fully back toward the road. Good night, Chloe. She watched him walk away, his boots heavy in the mud. He climbed into the massive truck, the headlights cutting through the driving rain. He pulled a U-turn on the gravel, the taillights bleeding red into the grey storm, until they vanished behind the hill. Chloe stood in the driveway alone. The rain was freezing, her clothes were ruined, and her property was flanked by a charred wasteland. But as she finally turned and walked back toward her dark, silent house, she realized her hands had stopped shaking. The pulsing ache behind her temples, the one that had haunted her for weeks, was gone. She opened the heavy glass door and stepped into the foyer. The house was cold, the power grid having tripped during the lightning storm. It was entirely silent. But the silence didn't feel like a tomb anymore. She walked into the dark kitchen, the smell of wet wool and ash clinging to her. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't check her emails. She walked over to the massive window and looked out into the rain. She couldn't see the tractor in the dark, but she knew it was there, standing guard on the property line. For the first time in years, Chloe took a deep, full breath. The air tasted like raw earth and rain. It tasted real. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, closed her eyes, and finally, let herself rest. Sometimes, the very things we think are beneath us are exactly what save us. Chloe had to watch her perfect, multi-million-dollar illusion almost burn to ash to realize the true value was in the dirt she had sneered at. What did you think of Chloe's brutal reality check? If this grounded drama kept you hooked, hit that like button, share it with a friend who appreciates a real story, and subscribe to the channel for more intense narratives.